perfect. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being here. My presentation today is going to highlight the methods and outcomes of a recent project that I undertook to assess a locally developed controlled vocabulary in use by the University of North Texas Libraries. This custom vocabulary is called the University of North Texas Libraries Browse Subjects, or UNTL-BS, which you'll hear me say UNTL-BS a lot. That's what that means. It serves as a tool for helping patrons navigate the cultural heritage collections contained on the portal to Texas history. The project that I undertook was part of a fellowship through the LEADING program, which is an IMLS-funded grant project run through Drexel University. And the aim of my particular project was ultimately to determine how well the structure and composition of this locally controlled vocabulary matches the contents of the collections that it's been used to describe. And by extension, how well it serves the needs of the patrons and communities that make use of those collections. And so first, I want to give a little bit of background on the portal to Texas history, which is the platform that this controlled vocabulary is being used for. The portal is a hub that was originally created in 2004 to provide access to rare historical and primary source materials from or about Texas. It collects digital resources from over 500 partner institutions and currently houses over 1.8 million items representing a diverse array of communities, cultures, and institutions connected to the state of Texas. Now, the UNTL-BS schema is supposed to be one way that users can interact with these collections. As the name might imply, it is specifically built to accommodate browsing behavior. And to that end, a browse by subject option is visible on the homepage of the portal, which when clicked leads users to a list of all of the UNTL-BS subject terms in the schema. Clicking on one of those subject terms will bring up a list of all of the records in the portal that have been assigned that term. And incidentally, all records on the portal are required to contain at least one of these UNTL-BS terms in order to be considered minimally complete. And as you can see from the sample record that I put there on the bottom left, UNTL-BS terms are assigned alongside other types of subject headings, such as Library of Congress subject headings and custom keywords that are supplied by staff. Now, as controlled vocabularies go, UNTL-BS is rather small in scope. It contains 16 major categories, which you can see they're listed on the right. And these are further subdivided into a total of 1,077 individual subject terms. These terms aim to cover the topics that appear with the most regularity in the portal's collections. The total number of terms has grown steadily as new partners have contributed collections to the portal. But despite this growth over the past 19 years or so, the UNTL-BS schema still remains considerably smaller than, say, the Library of Congress subject headings or something like the art and architecture thesaurus terms. But this is by design. It reflects both the local focus of the portal's collections as well as the schema's purpose as a browse-centric vocabulary. Whereas searching behavior, for example, might be better served by an exhaustive or near exhaustive list of hyper-specific terms, browsing, they have found, is better served by a limited number of broader categories, which make it easier for patrons to quickly get a sense of the general topical makeup of the collections that they're navigating. Now, onto the specific goals of my project. As I'm sure we're all well aware, systematic assessment is crucial when it comes to controlled vocabularies, not only for matters of efficiency, but also for matters of equity. The power to assign descriptive terms specifically to cultural heritage objects is highly significant. And by extension, the power to design a controlled vocabulary from which those terms are taken is an important ancillary step. And so it's therefore essential that librarians and information professionals periodically take stock of the terms that they use in their vocabularies. One way that I wanted to do this in my leading project was to ask the question of what terms are not present in the schema that should be. As we've seen in several prominent examples in recent years, the use of inaccurate or charged words in a vocabulary can do great harm, but so too, I thought, can the exclusion of terms or topics. And because of this, my project was focused not so much on finding UNTL-BS terms that should be removed or changed, but on uncovering topics that already exist with some prominence in the portal's collections, but are not yet reflected in the schema. From the outset, though, I saw that answering this kind of question in any sort of systematic or scalable way would present several, not insurmountable, but significant issues. The first of these is that any attempt to assess or talk about subject metadata carries with it a kind of chicken and egg problem, because the metric that determines whether subject terms are appropriate is really how well they match the aboutness of the collections, which is a very nebulous concept, and is also precisely what the subject headings are meant to express in the first place. So it's virtually impossible to get a real outside metric that you can measure the subject terms against, short of manually examining every record and making a personal judgment. And also, when dealing with collections as large as the portals are, as I said, over 1.8 million items from 500 different institutions, doing a manual assessment like that is really unfeasible. So an assessment like the one that I was attempting to do also faces major issues of scale. And so in the face of such complications, my first task was to figure out how I was going to go about approximating the topical composition of the portal's collections without setting up a kind of circular reference to the very subject metadata that I was trying to assess. In brainstorming my approach to this question, I realized that the key was going to be finding methods that were both schematic and computational in nature. Being schematic in my approach meant that I would not be focused on assessing the appropriateness of the headings on any individual portal record, but rather on the shape of the UNTL-BS schema itself. And this meant that I could look at aggregate values of the various branches of the schema and analyze how each branch related to the whole. On the other hand, being computational was useful, not only in that it provided a mathematical basis for my findings, but also in that it allowed me to conduct an assessment without much prior familiarity with the collections, because again, I was a visiting fellow at the University of North Texas, not a regular staff member there. I also wanted to make sure that my project methods would be repeatable so that similar analyses might be run again in the future as UNTL staff would continue to monitor the ongoing growth of this vocabulary. And finally, I also needed to make sure that my efforts would be targeted so that I would suggest only a limited number of new headings. And this goes back to the browse-centric purpose of the schema and its corresponding need to limit the total number of subject terms. Whatever changes I proposed would basically need to be small enough in number that they wouldn't overbloat the schema and compromise its browsing function. So in terms of the actual procedure, my project was going to consist of two major steps. First, I needed to build a short list of UNTL-BS subject headings for further investigation. And this would require developing ways of systematically flagging parts of the schema that could benefit from being expanded. And second, I needed to find some way to determine the optimal narrower terms that could be added to these areas of the schema. And to do this, I ended up turning to topic modeling, which I'll explain in more detail later. Many of the steps that I took while executing this project involved some highly theoretical and speculative ways of dealing with the schema and its contents. So it became very useful for me to adopt a concrete analogy for thinking about the UNTL-BS terms. So I imagine the entire schema throughout this process as a tree. The 16 main categories were the main branches, and each of these branches was subdivided into further sub-branches according to the various narrower terms that had been created underneath it. So each branch could therefore be longer based on the number of narrower terms it had under it, and wider the more times it gets used in the portal records. And so the relative size of the branches would therefore be compared to determine how balanced the tree as a whole is. But in reality, the quote-unquote tree that I was dealing with actually looked like this. The primary data set that I was using for the majority of the project steps was a full list of all 1,077 UNTL-BS terms and the number of times that each of them appeared on the portal's records. So with over 1,000 pieces to deal with, trying to visualize them in a simple list format was pretty much unfeasible. And turning them into something like this sunburst chart that I created on the right also didn't really leave much room to see the individual terms. So that's why I'll be coming back to this tree and branches analogy as we go through to hopefully explain some of the thinking behind my different analyses. So after capturing this primary data set that I was going to use, one of my first observations was that the distribution of the usage counts for each of these terms was extremely right skewed, meaning that the spread of the usage data was marked by a small number of really extreme outliers on the high end of the usage scale. In more concrete terms, what this means is that the majority of these browse terms were used fewer than 3,000 times each throughout the portal, but then there was a small handful that were used at an extremely high rate, over 100,000 times. And furthermore, because 4 of these extreme outliers came from the same main branch, the business, economics, and finance branch, that one part of the schema far surpassed all of the others in terms of size, which you can see on the pie graph on the right. It's more than half that blue business, economics, and finance section. So as I mentioned earlier, the first step of my project was to build a terms of interest list, which was comprised of UNTL-BS terms that I thought would benefit from being expanded with the addition of additional terms. And to do this, I used 3 primary methods. So the first of these methods was a statistical outlier analysis, which examined the occurrence rates of each of these terms in relation to the interquartile range of the entire data set. And this mostly just confirmed what I had already seen in my preliminary observations, that there's a very small number of really extreme outliers at the upper end of the scale. However, in addition to this small number of extreme outliers, the analysis also identified over 100 other terms that counted as technical outliers. And 100 was far too many for me to be investigating on a deeper level. So I followed up this initial outlier analysis by also looking at the rate of increase between each browse term and the next. So this helped me see that within the data set as a whole, the top 17 entries contained the highest concentration of terms that were not only straight outliers, but also represented a significant spike from the rest of the outliers at the top of the list. So I basically took these 17 terms from these 2 outlier analyses and added them to my preliminary terms of interest list. And then I moved on to my second method for adding terms to the terms of interest list, which is what I called the spread versus usage analysis. And this is the analysis that took the most inspiration from that tree and branches analogy that I was talking about. It examined the mathematical relationship between the number of times each term got used on the portal, its usage or the width of the branch, and the number of narrower terms that it has underneath it, its spread or the length of the branch. And the idea behind this approach is that in an ideal world with an ideal schema, those 2 numbers would be roughly equivalent, such that each term would receive a number of narrower terms proportional to the usage that it receives in the collections. So terms that get used more frequently would receive a larger number of narrower terms, which would in turn siphon that usage away from the broader term and ensure that the overall branch of the schema was balanced. And so cases where this was not the case would merit further investigation in my project. Over the course of doing this spread versus usage analysis, I found that there were 2 major ways that a branch of the UNTL-BS schema could be imbalanced. The first was when a branch was lopsided, that is, when it saw a lot of usage on the portal, but had no narrower terms underneath of it. And the term architecture buildings was one such example. That's the first sunburst chart on the left. Within the architecture main branch, which is what I've displayed in that chart, there are 7 subtopics. Most of these terms account for less than 10% of the total occurrence count on the branch, but the buildings subtopic accounts for over 73%. And despite this high occurrence rate, it has no narrower terms underneath of it. The second kind of imbalance that I saw were top-heavy terms, which did have narrower terms under them, but were still retaining a large number of the usages from their branch. And so one example of this is the term social life and customs, clubs and organizations. This term has 20 narrower terms under it, but each of those 20 terms receive far less uses on the portal than the broader term does. And so branches and sub-branches of the schema that exhibited one or both of these kinds of imbalances, I thought merited further examination, because both of those patterns suggest that there may be additional subtopics that are prevalent within the portal's collections, but aren't yet reflected in the browse schema. And again, the ultimate hope of doing all of this was that identifying these gaps in these areas would help us identify topics that are inadequately represented in the schema and hopefully suggest new terms that we could add to the vocabulary to better address the gaps. And so after doing all of these, the spread versus usage analysis, I actually identified 8 additional terms that I added to the ones that I had gotten from the previous step. And then finally, the third and final method that I used to round out this terms of interest list was what I called a collocation rate analysis. This one looked at how frequently each UNTL-BS term could be found alongside a large number of other subject terms on the portal records. And so the idea here was that terms that are always accompanied on records by a lot of other subject terms could have facets and subtopics that weren't yet represented in the schema, which is what causes staff, when they're cataloging these objects, to resort to using a lot of custom keywords in order to express those facets and subtopics. Like the spread versus usage analysis, this step looked at aggregates and percentages rather than whole numbers as a way of accounting for the vast size differences between the different branches of the schema. Unfortunately, or I guess perhaps fortunately, we didn't find any additional terms to add to the terms of interest list as a result of this analysis. I think I may skip this slide, although I guess I'll go over it really briefly. Basically, once I had all of these terms, my total at the beginning was 25 terms of interest, and I had 3 different further analyses that I did just to confirm that they had not been incorrectly added to my list. There were a number of different scenarios that I thought could have artificially inflated the number of uses that these terms of interest got. And I had tests to see whether or not they had been added for any of those erroneous reasons rather than being authentically on my terms of interest list. As a result of doing these 3, we did end up eliminating 3 different subject headings for various reasons. But I'm not sure if I'm going to run out of time, so I will not go into each of those in extreme detail, although I guess I can if you would like me to. Okay, so now that I had found a way to systematically highlight browse subjects that were in need of new narrower terms, and after I had checked that list for false positives, I also needed to find a way to systematically suggest the best narrower terms that we might be able to add to those branches. And the method that I choose to test in this project was topic modeling. As many of you may know, topic modeling relies on having a large corpus of text to identify groups of semantically related words within that text. So my goal was ultimately to be able to run a topic modeling algorithm for each of my terms of interest in order to derive some suggested subtopics that have prominence within the portal items that the terms were assigned to. Because, as I said earlier, the aboutness of the actual items themselves is rather nebulous, and not contained per se anywhere in the records, I decided to build my topic modeling corpuses for each of these terms of interest by compiling metadata from all of the portal item records that contained the targeted subject headings. So this metadata included items like, included fields like item titles, descriptions, and any subject terms that were not part of the UNTL-BS schema. And the idea was that these text snippets, when taken in aggregate, would at least approximate the aboutness of the term, and that by conducting topic modeling on the corpus, I would be able to gain some sort of insight into the relative topical breakdown of each of my target terms. So once I had one text corpus for each of my final terms of interest, I used the Mallet machine learning tool to train a topic modeling algorithm that would seek out groups of words that tended to appear alongside the targeted browse term subject within the portal's records in the hopes of gaining some insight into what themes carried the strongest semantic pull within that subject. Running the algorithm in Mallet gave me 5 groups of words for each of my target browse terms. And these 5 parcels were supposed to point to 5 topical nuggets that carried semantic weight within the subset of the portal's collections that shared the targeted browse term. By comparing the results of the topic model against the existing browse schema, I hoped to be able to identify 1 or more topics that had not yet been included in the UNTL-BS. However, The results that I got after this first run through were still pretty rough, and we've since determined that they are in need of further tweaking. After consulting with my project mentors, I learned from them that one reason for the noise that I was seeing in my initial results was that my text corpus have been heavily skewed by repeated words that are common in item titles and descriptions on the portal. So words like photograph and news and video. These types of words were showing up over and over again in my final output, and they were hedging out terms that might actually convey more semantic meaning. Similarly, the skew that I was seeing was also the result of several very large collections in the portal whose items all tend to share the same custom keywords. And so in terms of future steps, all of these words are going to need to be identified with the help of the collection's experts, such as my project mentors, and then added to the list of stop words in the algorithm that I trained so that the topic model can be run again and get cleaner results. So as unsatisfying an ending as that may be for this particular presentation, the reality is that this project is still ongoing and we need to continue tweaking our methods in order to answer our research questions adequately, which I think is a very common outcome for projects like this one. Nevertheless, though, I do think that the project as it stands right now can help exemplify a few important lessons about the assessment of controlled vocabularies and the potential issues of equity that are involved. So first, I think it illustrates clearly the need for relying on both computational methods and staff expertise to produce the best results. Even in the next steps that I was just describing, there's a need to leverage staff expertise before moving forward with the next iteration of our computational assessments. Secondly, I think the project serves as an important reminder of the task of identifying missing or underrepresented topics in a vocabulary. I think that is a very important side of this discussion, and it should be discussed alongside the challenges of removing or changing offensive and outdated terminology in vocabularies. And also, I think it's worth noting how such efforts are especially salient for locally controlled vocabularies, which have both a greater freedom to make changes quickly and also a greater obligation to ensure that their terms serve the communities that are represented in their collections. As a regionally specific vocabulary, the UNTL-BS carries with it a special responsibility to ensure that it adequately and equitably describes the cultures and communities that its collections come from. Not only that, but having local control over the UNTL-BS means that it's much easier for the University of North Texas libraries to add terms to the vocabulary than it would be for other larger or more ubiquitous vocabularies. But there are downsides to be considered that are connected directly to these strengths. So local control and ease of change means that any oversights on the part of staff who may not be cognizant of those obligations can have an even greater impact. And this, I think, further points to the importance of incorporating computational assessment methods alongside more traditional assessment methods, because hopefully when used together, those two approaches to assessment have a better chance of eliminating the blind spots than either would be able to have on their own. So I know that was a lot of statistical talk, but I would love to answer any questions about the work that I did.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And I think I speak for many of us in the session by saying it's a very impressive amount of work that went into this. And we appreciate you sharing the case study. Our first question comes from Jessica Bremen, and they ask, how does this term usage depend on archives with a lot of staff that can process and add more terms versus archives that have very little resources they can allocate to processing and metadata application?
Yeah, so I mean, that is always the issue, right? So I came on as an outside researcher to this project, and part of the reason for that was that UNTL they have an extensive staff, but for projects like this that are very intensive and sort of not part of the general workflow of collections processing, it is useful to have like an outside person come in and do a project like this. Part of the reason why I wanted to do this project is because it would take a lot of effort on the front end to get these workflows set up But then the hope would be once this kind of thing has been set, like once we figured out what tests to run and how to go through a workflow like this, it would become easier to just do the same sort of analysis again. And so that was part of the hope of my project, was that if I can have a proof of concept, then theoretically other institutions that may have less time to do all of the work that I had to do in the front end might be able to use some of the same methods without having to dedicate as much time to it. Because in reality, the data set that I had to work with was just the list of terms and the list of occurrences. So getting the data set wasn't as time consuming. It was really just developing the workflows. And hopefully now that I've done that, it might be less difficult for others to do similar things.
Yeah, that's actually a really great transition to the next, which is more of a comment from Bree Watson, who says, this is absolutely brilliant. When I examined Mackenzie's local vocabulary, there's almost nothing in the literature about how to do this. So they had to go through on their own and choose all of the terms. They really wish this presentation and your steps had existed then. It's really incredible, and they hope you write the process up. And then someone else chimed in. They would like you to also share the code. So it seems like there's a lot of interest in kind of seeing this project through as an aid to other institutions.
Yeah, I mean, so there is some code involved. Most of the hard coding that happened was one of my project mentors, Mark. A lot of what I did was actually just in Excel, just capturing the lists and doing a lot of Excel magic to figure things out. A lot of the spread versus usage analysis in particular was a lot of Excel. So there wasn't any coding on my part for that analysis, but there was certainly code at various points. We do have all of it on a GitHub repository, which I should be able to share. I guess if there's an opportunity to share links afterward, I might be able to do that, because it's all available on the University of North Texas Library's GitHub repository.
Yeah, if you send that to the conference organizers, we're sending out a massive kind of link document at the end. So we'll make sure that that is shared. So you can send that on to us. A lot of the comments are reiterating how much they would love to see the documentation, the code. We do have one more question, which I think will get us to the end. In terms of usage, John Bell says, I'm interested in both how tags are being assigned as well as how they're being used for discovery by users. Did you capture user requests? And if so, is there a correlation between terms that are frequently applied and those that users choose for searching or faceting?
So I did have some conversations with my project mentors at the beginning of the project about some analyses and some studies that they had done related to user behavior in the portal to Texas history. That was not part of my actual project. So I was trying to be cognizant of the information that they were sharing about the previous studies that they had done. And I believe some of that may also be published, but I personally don't know that I can necessarily speak to it because it wasn't part of the work that I did for them. But yeah, I know that the tags and the subject headings that I was working with were not created by the users. They were created by UNTL staff.
Great. Thank you again for your presentation. And I think that brings us to the end. We will now be, I think, taking a 30-minute break before our next case study, which will start at 1:30 Eastern time. So you can stay in the Zoom and it will pick back up in 30 minutes. And thank you again, Hannah.